Velthara Prime was a planet of water, art, and quiet opulence. With its shimmering coral cities built over endless oceans and triple suns that painted the skies in hues of lavender and gold, it was known across the galaxy as a destination for the elite. Those who visited came for the ambiance, not for the danger. Swimming, ironically, was almost taboo in the higher circles, viewed as primitive, unsophisticated, and best left to the working castes or historical dramatizations. The ocean was admired from afar, from the comfort of floating balconies and biofiltered spas. That day, a gathering of the Galactic Corps' diplomats, nobles, and military liaisons had assembled at the Pearl Pavilion, an open-air cliffside structure perched over one of Velthara's more tame inlets. It was an event meant to foster interspecies harmony and showcase the princess of the realm, Ylysera, a poised and well-educated symbol of her people's grace. Connor Vale, a human combat medic turned diplomatic attach, stood near the back of the crowd. He wasn't part of the elegant show. In fact, his presence was barely tolerated. Though humanity had recently joined the Galactic Accord, they were still considered raw, capable but uncultured, courageous but crude. He had been assigned to this event as a courtesy, a token gesture of inclusion. And so he stood in a dark uniform, hands behind his back, observing the whole pageant with a quiet disinterest. But then everything changed. A loud, unnatural splash cut through the hum of polite conversation. Guests turned. The music faltered. All eyes locked onto the sea below. A figure flailed in the water, graceful limbs now clumsy and desperate. It was Princess Ylysera. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but not a single person moved to help. Her entourage stood frozen. The nobles whispered nervously but remained still. Even her guards hesitated. There were too many rules about dignity, about protocol, about liability. It was improper to interfere unless sanctioned. Intervention could insult the family, violate tradition, or worse, spark political scandal. But none of that mattered to Connor. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for orders. He broke into a run. People shouted. A hovering security drone tried to intercept him, but he slipped past. His boots kicked up wet sand as he charged past the velvet barriers and dove, full-bodied, into the water. Alien sea hit him like a wall of cold needles. The gravity was slightly lower than Earth's and the water denser, but the resistance didn't stop him. He kicked downward, opening his stinging eyes to search for her. Below the surface, the water was murky in streaks of blood and bioluminescent particles. He spotted her at last, sinking slowly. Her leg was cut badly, likely caught on a jagged coral shelf hidden below. Her limbs flailed weakly, eyes wide with terror and confusion. Her body, though amphibious, couldn't handle blood loss and panic in tandem. She was going to die. He surged downward, reaching her just as her movement slowed to a terrifying stillness. With one arm wrapped around her chest, he kicked for the surface, lungs burning, adrenaline screaming. When they broke through, he gasped in air and paddled with raw strength, ignoring the protests from his shoulders and back. She coughed weakly, head lolling against his shoulder. Her gills spasmed, still functioning, but barely. She needed immediate treatment. Connor half-dragged, half-carried her to the shallows. The tide pulled at them, but he fought it off. Finally, he reached solid ground and collapsed onto the beach with her in his arms. He didn't stop. With trembling fingers, he pulled his field medkit from a thigh pouch and activated the emergency stim. He pressed the hypo into her neck and sealed her wound with a thermal coagulation patch. She spasmed and then stilled, her breathing evening out barely. Around them, the crowd remained silent. Dozens had watched, unmoving, unwilling. And now that the danger had passed, they still offered no applause, no approval. The medics arrived only when the spectacle was over, hovering down in pristine white robes and golden trim. They took her from his arms. Without even making eye contact, Connor sat there on the wet sand, breathing heavily, drenched in blood and salt. No words were offered. No praise, just silence. But somewhere deep in the crowd, someone finally whispered, "The ocean of Velthara Prime was no gentle body of water. Beneath its serene shimmering surface hid powerful undercurrents, jagged reefs, and predators unlike anything Earth's waters held." But none of that mattered to Connor Vale. As the crowd watched in stunned silence, Connor swam harder than he had ever swum in his life. His arms cut through the thick alien sea, and each kick seemed to drain what little energy he had left after the dive. He could taste metal in his mouth, whether from the saline-rich water or sheer effort, he didn't know. All he cared about was the alien girl slipping deeper into the gloom. Princess Elisera, daughter of the high tides, lay suspended in the water like a fallen star, her limbs swaying slowly in the current. The long violet fins that marked her as royalty were torn and trembling, and blood spilled from the deep gash on her thigh. Her eyes, large and luminous like all Veltharians, had dulled with panic and oxygen deprivation. Even though her species was semi-aquatic, the trauma was more than her body could handle. Connor reached her in those final seconds before unconsciousness claimed her. She still had fight left in her, but it was faint, just a twitch here, a flick there. She reacted as he grabbed her, her claws scraping weakly against his chest, instinctively trying to fend off what she thought was a predator. "Easy," he shouted through bubbles, though he knew she couldn't hear. His arms locked under hers, and he kicked up with all his strength, fighting the pull of her limp body and the alien currents dragging them down. He surfaced with a desperate gasp, coughing violently as oxygen burned its way back into his lungs. Elisera sputtered, barely conscious, her head lolling against his shoulder. Back on shore, the noble still did not move. Hovercam zoomed in from above, recording every moment. Veltharian med drones circled above the waterline but did not enter. They were not permitted to breach their designated safe zone without command. Authority. Connor didn't care. One arm held Elisera close. The other paddled, dug, clawed at the water. Every meter to shore felt like dragging a boulder, but he refused to stop. Gritting his teeth, he pressed forward, driven by something far older than protocol instinct. The human need to protect. By the time he reached the shallows, his body screamed for rest. He hauled them both onto the damp sand, waves licking at their legs. She lay there, bleeding, her chest rising in shallow breaths. Her eyes opened once, briefly, and met his. There was recognition in them now, gratitude, and something else. Confusion. Connor didn't pause to interpret it. He pulled his soaked medkit from a leg pouch and opened it with trembling hands. Earth tech was crude by galactic standards, but it worked. He applied a thick coagulant paste to the wound and pressed a thermal patch against her leg. She twitched in pain, but the bleeding slowed. Then came the stim injector standard for field trauma. He plunged it into her neck. A second later, her eyes flared open fully, pupils dilating. She gasped sharply, gills fluttering rapidly as her body stabilized. Only then did the official med team descend. Veltharian medics in flowing gold robes, untouched by water or urgency, finally arrived in hovering platforms. They examined her, said nothing to Connor, and took her gently onto a levitating stretcher. One of them glanced at him with a mixture of curiosity and distaste, as if unsure whether to thank him or reprimand him. Then they were gone. Connor sat there, soaked to the bone, breathing heavily as the ocean lapped at his heels. His arms ached, his ribs throbbed from the dive, and every muscle in his body buzzed with post-adrenaline fire. Still, no one spoke to him. No one offered him a towel. Not even an acknowledgment dot around him. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, uncertain whether to be impressed or scandalized. To many of them, what he'd done was an act of madness, noble perhaps, but reckless. He had bypassed chain of command, ignored cultural protocols, and made a very public statement that in a moment of crisis, humanity acted without hesitation. That terrified them, but Connor wasn't thinking about any of that. As the medics disappeared over the hill and the crowd faded away, he sat still on the sand, eyes locked on the horizon. He didn't know if what he'd done would save her. He didn't know what consequences would come. But deep down, he knew one thing. 2 days had passed since the rescue, and Connor Vale was no longer a silent observer in the background of diplomatic pageantry. He had become the center of an interstellar controversy. The images of him diving into the ocean, dragging the drowning Veltharian princess to shore, and performing emergency treatment had gone viral across several systems. Humans were applauding him. Veltharians, however, were not. Now standing inside the gleaming chamber of the Coral Throne, the governing seat of Velthara Prime, Connor found himself on trial. Not for breaking a law exactly, no one could quite say what law he had violated, but for disrupting the dignity of the royal court. A tribunal had been assembled, made up of Veltharian nobles, cultural advisors, and legal interpreters. They wore elaborate robes that shimmered with bioluminescent inks and moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a species unaccustomed to confrontation. The lead speaker, Chancellor Dale Morin, addressed him from behind a pedestal shaped like a rising wave. You breached sacred boundaries. Sergeant Vale, you entered our holy waters without sanction, intervened in a royal matter without authorization, and most egregiously performed medical acts on our heir without consent. These actions, though possibly well-intended, have caused great embarrassment to the Coral Court. Connor remained standing in silence, hands clasped behind his back. The room echoed with soft murmurs and the occasional flicker of disdain. No one in the tribunal looked him directly in the eye. To them, he was an aberration, a variable in a system that had, for centuries, run without disruption. Another member of the tribunal, Lady Phaisha, spoke next. Do you not understand how fragile diplomacy is? Had the princess died, it would have been a tragedy. But your interference has now placed us in a dilemma. To reward you risks undermining centuries of protocol. To punish you may offend your government. Connor's jaw clenched. So you're saying it would have been better if I let her drown? The question echoed like a slap across water. Several counselors hissed softly in disapproval. Others shifted uncomfortably. The Chancellor's eyes narrowed. You presume too much. There were rescue measures in place. Medical drones were en route. Had you simply waited, she wouldn't have made it, Connor interrupted, voice firm. She was bleeding out. Her body was in shock. You can dress this up in tradition, but you know the truth. No one moved. No one acted. Except me. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. He took a slow breath, forcing his temper down. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I didn't think about politics. I just saw someone drowning, and I acted. The tribunal didn't respond immediately. They huddled together, whispering in subharmonic frequencies, the kind that no human could hear or interpret. Finally, the Chancellor turned back. The tribunal finds you in breach of decorum. You will not be charged or imprisoned, but you are to be removed from your current post, reassigned pending review by your embassy, effective immediately. Connor's heart sank not because of the punishment itself, but because it confirmed what he already suspected. Saving a life meant less to these people than maintaining appearances. He nodded stiffly, turned, and walked out. Later that day, Connor stood at the orbital shuttle port, his travel bag slung over one shoulder. He watched ships come and go through the transparent terminal walls. His new orders would take him to a backwater moon in the outer sectors, far from anything diplomatic or meaningful. A quiet exile under the guise of temporary reassignment. He wasn't angry at being punished. Not really. He was just tired. Disappointed. For all the talk of unity and cooperation, the Galactic Council still treated humanity as outsiders brash. Unpredictable, unworthy of trust. As he stared out at the sky, a soft voice called behind him, "Wait." Connor turned. It was Eilweis Era. She stood with a slight limp, leaning on a cane of living coral. Her skin had regained its natural glow, and the wound on her leg was now a silver scar. 2 royal guards flanked her, but she waved them away. She wore a flowing sea blue garment, and her eyes held a mixture of wonder, defiance, and gratitude. "I wasn't allowed to speak at your hearing," she said softly. "They said it would complicate the optics, but I wanted you to know I remember everything. You saved me, Connor Vale. You didn't just act. You chose to act. When everyone else froze, you moved." He blinked, surprised. "I was just," she held up a hand. "No, you were human. And that's exactly what this galaxy needs." She stepped forward and placed something cold and glowing into his palm. A pendant, shaped like a tear of water, ancient, alive. It pulsed with bioluminescent veins. "This marks you as bonded of the tides," she said. "It's an honor never given to outsiders, until now." Connor looked down at the pendant, stunned. It glowed brighter in his hand. And for the first time since the rescue, he smiled. After the tribunal, after the quiet exile they called reassignment, he had prepared himself for a silent departure. The galaxy didn't reward reckless compassion, it barely acknowledged it. He had packed his gear, reported to the orbital shuttle port, and settled into the belief that his brief chapter in Valfarian history was already being erased. But then she appeared. Princess Ilisera stood in the terminal's arched corridor, her form framed by the glow of the setting suns. Through the crystal glass walls, she leaned on a carved coral cane, still recovering from her injury, but there was strength in her eyes. Regal, defiant, and alive. The guards flanking her hesitated when she stepped forward, but at her wordless gesture, they backed off, leaving her alone with the human who had changed everything. Connor rose from his seat in stunned silence. "I wasn't supposed to come here," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "They told me it would send the wrong message." He raised an eyebrow. "You mean gratitude?" Her lips curled into a faint smile. "No, the message that I respect a human more than the council." Connor blinked, unsure how to respond. She continued, "They didn't want me to speak at your hearing. They said it would complicate diplomacy, might be seen as favoritism or weakness. But the truth is, they were afraid." "Afraid?" he asked, stepping closer. She nodded. "You embarrassed them, Connor. You exposed what they fear most, that when it matters, they hesitate. And your kind doesn't." He looked down at the floor for a moment, then said, "I didn't mean to humiliate anyone. I just saw someone drowning." "And you acted," she said firmly. "You didn't wait for permission. You didn't pause to think about political consequences. You moved. That's what separates your kind from so many others. That's why I asked to see you." She reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out something small and glowing. It shimmered like a drop of living water, blue and green veins pulsing beneath its translucent surface. She placed it gently in his hand. The pendant was warm and alive, humming faintly like a heartbeat. "This is a tide bond," she said, "symbol of ancient Valfarian oaths. It is usually given to those who marry into royal blood or perform a deed of such significance it echoes through our culture. I had to fight the council to release it to you. Connor stared at it, stunned. You didn't have to do this. She smiled again, wider this time, more freely. No, I wanted to. You gave me breath when I had none left. Now I give you something. In return, not obligation, not reward, but choice. Choice? He asked. She stepped closer, her gaze intense. You can keep this and return to Earth or to whatever world they reassign you to. It will be your honor to carry, and no one will question your bravery again. Or, her voice softened. You can stay. Connor's heart skipped. Stay? He repeated. She nodded. I've spoken with others in the court. Things are changing. Slowly, stubbornly, but changing. You could be part of that. As an advisor, as a teacher, as whatever you choose to be. Connor didn't answer right away. The pendant pulsed in his hand like a living promise. His instincts, so often dismissed in this galaxy as dangerous or impulsive, had saved her life. And now, those same instincts pulled him towards something else, not just a second chance, a new path. I thought I was being exiled, he said with a chuckle. You were, she said, but now you've been invited. There was no fanfare, no applause, just two people standing in a sunlit terminal, surrounded by the quiet hum of departing ships and incoming data streams. Connor looked into her eyes. They were the color of deep-sea sapphire. They held no deception, no demand, only respect. And maybe, behind that, the beginning of something deeper. He closed his fingers around the tide bond. I'll stay. For the first time since the rescue, Elisera looked truly relieved. The tension in her shoulders eased. Then welcome, she said, to something new. And with that, the human who had once been dismissed as reckless, uncultured, and disruptive stepped into a future shaped, not by obedience but by courage. In the weeks that followed Connor's decision to stay on Velthara Prime, the tides of change rippled farther than anyone had expected. The galaxy had seen many brave acts throughout its long and complicated history, but few had been so simple and human. There had been no strategy, no diplomacy, no calculation in Connor's dive-just instinct. A decision made in seconds, driven by a raw desire to save a life. And while the tribunal may have treated that as a problem, the people did not. At first, Connor's continued presence near the royal court stirred discomfort among the Veltharian elite. He was viewed as a political complication and unpredictable outsider who had forced their society to look in the mirror. But as Princess Elisera's recovery continued and her gratitude became publicly known, attitudes began to shift. The footage of the rescue, once suppressed by palace media advisors, was eventually leaked, perhaps intentionally. The sight of a human, drenched and bloodied, dragging a limp royal figure from the ocean moved many. For younger Veltharians, it shattered old preconceptions. They had been raised to believe that humans were volatile and primitive, but what they saw was compassion and courage unbound by tradition. That image did more for interspecies relations than 100 years of official diplomacy. Connor didn't seek attention. He refused formal interviews, declined titles, and avoided the media frenzy that followed. Instead, he worked quietly, assisting Veltharian medics with emergency response reforms. He volunteered to train palace guards in trauma intervention, offering a perspective they had never been exposed to, action before consensus, risk before retreat. And Elisera, she visited often, sometimes under the guise of palace oversight, sometimes under no guise at all. Their relationship blossomed, not just romantically, but ideologically. Elisera had long harbored doubts about her society's rigid customs. Connor didn't push her. He simply showed her a different way to live. In their long conversations on balconies and gardens, beneath glowing crystal trees, she discovered what it meant to trust her instincts. Even when they defied tradition. Soon, Glycera brought Connor before the Tide Assembly, the Lesser Council, beneath the main tribunal. There, she introduced a new proposal, a joint initiative between Veltharian and human medics, starting with a cross-training program in ocean rescue, field medicine, and emergency ethics. It was met with resistance. Naturally. But Glycera now held more influence than ever, not because of her bloodline, but because she had survived. And she credited that survival to the very human standing beside her. Against all odds, the initiative passed. And so, for the first time in Veltharian history, human medics walked the choral halls of the royal academies. Protocols were revised. Training programs were rewritten. What began as a scandal became the foundation of something stronger than diplomacy, mutual respect. Months later, during the annual ceremony of the tides, Glycera took the stage. Her leg had healed, but the scar remained a gleaming silver line she chose not to hide. She stood before her people in ceremonial finery, her voice amplified across the oceanic city. We celebrate the rhythms of water, the memory of tides, and the resilience of our people, she said. But this year, we celebrate something more. A life saved, a bond formed, and a lesson remembered. Hesitation can cost lives. Instinct, when guided by compassion, can reshape worlds. Then she turned. Connor stood beside her, wearing a ceremonial sash over a simple Earthborn uniform. The crowd fell silent as she stepped forward and took his hand. In the moment I needed help, she continued, none moved. None but one. A human. She placed her hand over his chest, over the spot where the Tide Bond pendant now rested. The waves remember him. The cheers that followed were unlike anything the planet had ever known. In time, stories were written. Some romanticized, others political. But one tale always echoed the loudest, taught in schools, sung in songs, whispered on balconies. They watched her sink. He chose to act. And the ocean, once silent, now sings his name. Connor never asked to be a hero. He never wanted a place in history. But he earned something far rarer in the galaxy than fame. He earned trust. He earned love. He earned change.